how we get there, and how we spend our time. We work at Fayette Alliance to positively impact countywide planning and zoning policies, which create a better quality of life, economy, and environment for all. We advocate for smart growth, which is a strategy that balances environmental protection, economic development, and social objectives to meet the needs of today without compromising quality of life for future generations. But we know that historically, land use policy was used and its impacts continue to reinforce community-wide inequities, segregation, and discrimination. Decades-old policies across the country continue to disproportionately impact marginalized communities and people of color. We know that talking about smart growth must mean that growth is equitable, that the investments and the policies made at our city levels benefit all of our citizens, especially those underserved Black and Brown communities that have felt the impacts of planning and zoning policy for decades. We want Lexington to be a strong, inclusive city. This means advocating for policy which is sustainable for our future, fiscally responsible, and most importantly, equitable. Talking about infrastructure investments, infill and redevelopment, housing affordability, and diversity of housing options and more are critical pieces of this work towards equity. Today, we're excited to hear from Chris on how land use, equity, and responsible growth are intertwined, and how national experts are approaching advocacy efforts and changing policies for growing cities to ensure that as we move forward, we are ensuring better quality of life for all of our citizens that are also responsible and sustainable for our communities. So again, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Chris Zimmerman. Chris from Smart Growth America, we're so happy you're here and excited to have a discussion with you today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. When you originally invited me some time back, I was really looking forward to getting to Lexington because I must confess, it's somehow a city I have managed to miss, even though I've been interested in it for many years. And, you know, it has all kinds of interest to people interested in urban planning, besides all the other reasons. I'm sure you love your community. I thought this was finally going to be the year I'd get there, but apparently I'll have to.
We'll have you back someday.
So I am really pleased to be able to be asked to speak on this topic that is obviously of great interest to me. I have way too much to say and way too many slides, although that's usually my situation, which means I will tend to speak fast, I think, and go through some things more quickly than I like, and still I'm leaving so much uncovered. But what I'm going to try to do is get through fast enough so that there's time for us to talk, so you can quiz me on anything that I've missed or you have a question about or disagree with, and hopefully we can get there and have a good conversation as well. So if everybody's ready, buckle your seatbelts, here we go. So I'm asked to talk about, you know, how land use equity and smart growth relate, and there's a lot of stories to tell about that. And I have 5 stories here to get through, and that I think are key, or you could say 4 stories, and then the question of what it all means. And that's mostly going to leave it for us to talk about at the end. But the parts that sometimes, you know, many of you will be familiar with a lot of what I'm going to talk about. You only know pieces of it, but I think putting it all together is what makes the clear impression about how we got where we are today. And I'm very oriented toward history, so I tend to go back, and sometimes go back very far. So, you know, we've been building cities and, you know, communities, built places, a built environment for quite a few thousand years now. If you look at the history and prehistory, the stuff before we even wrote, you find that communities were built with certain common things going all the way back to the earliest archaeological records. And that, I think, reflects fundamental things about human beings, about, you know, the way we are physically, biologically. And so, you know, if you can go back and pick a lot of different things, I have an archive of these kind of images, but, you know, this one happens to be from Mesopotamia, which is, you know, supposedly the cradle of civilization. And, you know, it's reconstructed from archaeology, obviously, but it shows that, you know, this place had a grid of streets. It was a compact development. There were public spaces designated in the plan, and there was a clear urban-rural boundary. Of course, in older times, the urban boundary was their urban boundary was a physical thing often because you had to wall your city in. But it was, this was sort of typical. And, we could see this down really through the ages. This is ancient Greece, same thing. This is a Roman city in England or Wales, I want to say. And, again, the same kind of basic patterns and some of the same qualities. And when, people started building cities on our current continent, they did this pattern pretty much from coast to coast. Again, this is Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. You see the grid of streets, the designation of key public sites, specification about where buildings would go in ways that related, so the buildings relate to one another and people could use these places. And we kept doing this. This is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is Indianapolis. This is a city you're familiar with. So, you can look at this all over the continent and find this sort of pattern that up until the middle of the 20th century is more or less the way we built any town. And it reflected human needs. And if it was a big city or a small town, you'd find more or less the same basic structure. There was a mix of uses. Everything was fairly compact. You got to be able to walk because that's the way people could get around. You had buildings of different stories. They didn't have elevators, but they could still go a few stories. And you had different building types on a block: housing, offices, stores, and so on. So people could walk to everything. And we built like crazy this way all across the United States, from the beginning of the country all the way through till, as I said, about the middle of the 20th century. Now, of course, along the way, some other things happened to cities. In particular, the Industrial Revolution happened, which meant, we had more people moving from rural areas into cities and coming to work in manufacturing. And that had certain consequences because certainly early industry in particular was really dirty. Not necessarily healthy and not necessarily safe, but it had to be near the workers, so it was. And cities got to be fairly challenging environments, let's say, in terms of both the effluent thrown off by industry, but also the fact that we crammed a whole lot of people moving in quickly into small spaces, and they became fairly crowded and dirty and unhealthy, and got a reputation for such as a real physical fact. By the later part of the 19th century, people were dying from diseases more than just about anything else, from infectious diseases that were associated with inadequate sewage infrastructure, clean water and that kind of thing, associated again with the dense cities of the time. So, this became a problem. And in many ways, it led to the creation of the modern planning profession that emerged in the 20th century. So the problem they were taking up really was, how do you plan cities so that we don't have people in these difficult environments? And they were dangerous because people lived next to, you had apartment buildings over fuel, which is to say hay for horses, which was highly flammable, and people would die in terrible fires, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that led to the creation of the first modern zoning coming out of New York City in 1916, and the idea of separating uses. And it really is about separating industry, industrial uses and so on, noxious things, from where people lived, which made a certain amount of sense. And then that idea kind of took off. And one of the things that's often missed in conversations about this, I think many people may not be aware of, is that although it's a local thing, mostly controlled at the local level, zoning is something that came to the United States from the top, in effect, because it was promulgated by the federal government, particularly under a very activist Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s by the name of Herbert Hoover. And as a result, they promulgated a standard ordinance in a fairly short amount of time. A lot of states had adopted it. There was a Supreme Court case that upheld it, and so said it wasn't a taking, so you could do it. And then more and more places started doing it. And when we developed later in the 20th century with new communities being formed, they tended to pick up these same standard kind of zoning laws, and again, more standard city planning acts being promulgated. So that's why they're somewhat common. The result of this, though, was kind of pushed to extremes, And so we wound up not just, kind of separating things in the way of the initial effort in a big city, but more and more as we moved out and planned new places, we pretty radically separated uses, including, the, places we would work, which, would go, in one place, places we would live would go in another. So, where we work, where we shop, where we live, where we do civic business, all in different locations, all connected by an arterial road, which reflects the other major change, of course, which was the automobile. So we, basically had these two things happening that we had to accommodate these uses in a separated fashion, and we got the car, which meant you could really spread them out, and we did that. And then, of course, we did lots of things to accommodate the car. And again, a lot of federal policy. The obvious ones being the interstate highway program's the biggest one. We paid for roads at 90 cents on the dollar, basically, for states and localities to build new roads, to empty their cities, to move out and create new areas of development. And that was a huge subsidy. But there was also home building programs, which favored these places outside the cities, and smaller things like new rules for capital depreciation adopted in the 50s that made it cheap to throw up new shopping places compared to fixing up old places that used to exist. So we got a whole new set of rules for building communities, which became associated with suburban America. And those basically meant, in particular, zoning with extreme separation of uses, not mixed use development anymore, and everything designed so you could do anything you needed to do by car. The flip side being you could only do it by car. And you got a different road system. Instead of a grid, you got this hierarchy of sort of dendritic streets, and we really didn't have time for pedestrians or money, because when you spread all those streets all over the places, it's a lot more expensive to do sidewalks. So, again, we moved into new places that were really only designed to be accessible by car. And in the late 20th century, this became the ideal place to live. We brought our shopping with us, and instead of being on Main Street, we moved to shopping centers that are surrounded by ample parking. And similarly for our offices, as our jobs moved out of the cities, and by 1970 or so, most of the jobs had moved out of central cities and into the periphery, and were continuing to move out. Again, office park with lots of parking. You might need to get in your car to go from one building to the next, but you could always find a parking space. And we pretty much designed everything that we did around our automobiles. So instead of having homes oriented in a way that assumed people were going to be walking, maybe seeing neighbors, maybe sitting out front on the porch, we created homes that were basically storage units for cars with residents attached. And by the late 20th century, we were building a lot of things like this. And of course, this affected everything we did, and we adjusted our lifestyle accordingly, doing more and more things in different ways to reflect what we had built. Now, that seemed to be, the American dream that everybody was happy about. We were told it was the American dream, and, it's the way we want to live, obviously, because that's what we're doing, kind of ignoring the fact that there was an awful lot of regulation and government subsidy creating the supply of what you had to choose from. But, it seemed to be like that's what people were happy with. But then things really started to change by the end of the 90s. And, most of us, again, are familiar with the story now, so I'll go pretty quickly. But it isn't, I think it's worth reviewing. What changed? Well, things about the economy changed, and the demography changed in big ways over the last generation, really. And specifically, our economy moved from manufacturing to the knowledge economy, and that has changed the demand for labor and for the way businesses think about locating. And the big demographic change was the gradual retirement of my generation. The greatest generation, well, no, that's the other ones. The biggest, no, we're not the biggest anymore either. We used to be the biggest generation, and we were the big deal. Just ask us. And then, we had kids, and that resulted in the millennial generation, who have all been entering the workforce. And we've seen as a result of that, the combination of the new generation, moving up, and the older generation in different circumstances than in the 60s and 70s, let's say, changing the pattern of demand in the market. So, just to make the point, you can see that the baby boomers had a long reign as the top of the workforce. The millennials kind of shoot up here and take over around 2015. If you were born between 64 and 80 or 82, something like that, and I imagine a few people on this are probably in that range, and you're a Gen Xer, you had a brief reign in there a little bit, just a little time there, a few years when you were actually number one, but I think nobody noticed. The first headline came up when the millennials took over, and everybody kind of forgot about the Gen Xers, so I'm sorry. But the good news is, if you're a Gen Xer, you're probably going to be the boss of a bunch of millennials for a while. So, don't let them forget it. But this dramatic rise, this has an impact, just as baby boom had an impact, because it's just a big change in the market, and it has persistent effects. And we've all seen these analyses, because millennials are now analyzed and psychoanalyzed like the baby boomers were by marketing people everywhere. But stereotypes aside, it does turn out that they, oops, don't want to say that. It does turn out that millennials in particular started choosing where they wanted to live before finding a job, and that had an impact. And then on the other end, we've got the baby boom generation having basically the longest retirement of any such cohort in the history of humanity, and being the largest group of senior citizens as a result that we've ever had, which means which is a big deal for demand, because these households, which are going to be an increasing share of demand, are smaller households necessarily. So they change the demand for housing, and basically what we're getting between starter households at one end and retirees on the other end and downsizers is a big change in the demand for housing, because both of those have tended to want somewhat smaller units and more affordable homes and things closer to other activities. And I don't have a lot of time, but people sometimes ask me about, well, isn't that just because the millennials, they put off having kids? Once they have kids, they're going to want to go and do the same thing. And it's true for some of them. But one of the things you have to bear in mind is that there's a fundamental change in the overall composition of the society demographically, where if you look at 1960 here, you see this is the baby boom generation as kids. This is me and people my age, and it got really narrow at the top because there weren't as many people living at the older age. If you look at demographic projections now, as that generation retires, you don't have so much of a pyramid anymore as you had before. It's getting more and more rectangular. So basically, households with kids are smaller to start with now than they used to be, but there's just fewer of them in the market. So we got kind of the wrong housing stock as a result. And then there's the economic thing, which is that we've just changed the way we do business, and even in manufacturing, we do it differently. So whereas businesses used to chase smokestacks, they now have to chase talent, because the natural resources of the knowledge economy are really skilled young professionals. And this shows up in a lot of different ways in surveys of corporate executives, and the statements of folks. And again, this is getting pretty common, so I'm assuming you probably know this stuff. And we've seen, as a result, a reversal of that historic trend, where businesses were all moving out to the suburbs, where over the last decade they've been moving much more into towns. And even on the local level, traditional main streets are back. On the in big markets, transit is what it's about. And this report from Jones Lang LaSalle showing that almost half of new construction was taking place in transit accessible submarkets. There are a lot of stuff, a lot of material go looking into this and what it means for the suburbs, because that's mostly what we built, and that's where most of us still live. So a lot of questions, and really the big question of the 21st century is, how do suburbs adapt? So just to say a few things like that, again, this is just indication from one particular book by Jason Beskey and David Dixon, with the young educated people moving to urban centers, and with the economics of the commercial real estate market reflecting that, where housing values are going up, in cities relative to suburbs, office rents similarly, and overall there's a price value premium for places that are walkable, whether we're talking big markets or small markets. It's shown up everywhere in the last couple decades. Again, there's a lot of ways of looking at this, but it shows up in the numbers. And as I said, the housing stock doesn't seem to match what we have. because we have lots of single family. Again, it's not that people aren't going to want single family homes. A lot of them will. Some people are going to want to live where they're going to drive, and they want that. That's fine. The thing is that we built so much of that you know, we've got a big supply of it. And on the other hand, we have a shortage of the kinds of things that many people are looking for, and that is showing up in a big way in housing prices. So what this has meant for the last couple decades has been a real opportunity for urban places, by which I mean not just, you know, Chicago and New York, but, you know, sort of second tier cities like Nashville, but also smaller towns. At the same time, it means a challenge for those places that were built in the late 20th century. Partly because of companies choosing different places to live, and a lot of the stuff that was built not having value. A lot of this reflected in, you know, the restructuring of home prices, but also shopping centers and the decline of the mall, and the need for walkable environments for high value employment centers. So that also means the potential for a lot of these suburban areas to become poorer, and therefore have more needs relative to tax base, which is showing up in a lot of places. And just in case you were wondering, and I won't go into a lot of this, but no, COVID-19 is not going to change this in the long run. And I'll leave arguments we might want to have for that for mostly for later. But all the things that drive people to want to be in areas of agglomeration and have driven it for 10,000 years or so are still in place. And in the past, you know, we've had things that threaten cities like plagues. The Black Death in Europe wiped out a third to a half of the population of cities. And, you know, within a generation or two, we had the Renaissance. So, you know, people do come back for all kinds of reasons. And, you know, if you watch what happens here, we're having a hard time containing this, in part because people really want to congregate. They really want to be with other people, and all the economics and demographics that drives it will continue. But again, if we want to argue with that, we can do that later. I want to talk about the fiscal part of this, because fiscal sustainability is kind of a big issue. And the way we changed the rules in the 20th century to build places on land use, on transportation, all of that had a secondary but really big impact on the cost of doing government that people kind of didn't notice until it started to hit them. And that's basically that the development pattern impacts what you spend on government and the revenue raised, particularly at the local level. And what I'm talking about here is the difference between, you know, this traditional, more compact development versus the sprawling development, the spread out pattern that we promulgated so heavily in the late 20th century. Basically, it turns out sprawl has a cost. When you've got all this roadway relative to, you know, taxpayer, the infrastructure costs more, and maintaining it, that means, you know, roads, it means what goes under the roads, the pipes, water systems and all that. And services are less efficient because now you got to spread them all out. You know, the police department, the fire department, they have to cover more ground. The school buses have to go farther, and those are expensive systems to run. Trash pickup, all that stuff adds up. So we've been analyzing this for a number of years now, and we developed a model that was based on looking at the geospatial impact on municipal costs. A lot of fiscal impact studies are done. They tend to just assume that if you increase the number of residents and employees, you know, that it's done on an average cost basis. The cost of doing government will go up proportionally to the number of new people, without looking at the impact of where you put them and how you develop. And there's a relationship here, and, you know, you don't have to worry about the numbers too much here, but basically that, you know, if you look at it just in terms of roads, which drives a lot of this, as you increase the you know, as you spread out the folks and decrease the density, you have less road area, and you wind up with, you know, higher costs. So you have basically a more road area covered by fewer taxpayers, is one way to think of it. And, you know, when we run numbers, what we find is frequently when we do scenario planning, and so we say, well, suppose you're going to continue to grow and you can develop, how are you going to grow? You're going to do it the way you've been doing it, and we model this, and, you know, we look at the same basic scenario under different ways of developing. Like if you do low density spread out the way you have been doing versus if you do downtown infill, or what if you go higher density, more infill, and, you know, if you get to where you get a premium that we see on revenue, what happens? This one was done for Macon, Georgia, but this one's for Indianapolis. But this is just shown to be typical, which is we frequently find that the low density suburban model doesn't pay for itself. That is that as you grow, you will have more cost than you get revenue from the new development. Whereas if you go to, more of an infill approach, with denser development, you can get a premium. You actually come out ahead. This was the most recent thing we did in Grand Rapids, in Michigan. So, you can sum it up this way, basically, that greenfield density at low development tends to have lower negative net fiscal impact. Again, the difference between the cost of the new development and the revenues you get. Whereas high density infill tends to be highly positive, and that pattern generally shows up. So that's the next part. And then to talk a little bit about the social equity and race, which was through all of this, all the history that I talked about, which is that the growth of the late 20th century American suburb, came up within the framework of officially sanctioned segregation. It's somewhat ironic in that the development of these places sort of coincides with the beginning of the bringing down of some of the formal barriers. Brown versus the Board of Ed was decided in 1954. But at the same time, some of those legal barriers, those legal causes of segregation were beginning to come down. We put into place a whole lot of development in our land use and our transportation policy that actually exacerbated these things. So many of the first land use regulations that were adopted were very explicit about segregation being part of this. They were, the racism was built into them. There were also private aspects of this, because there were, in places where you didn't have that, you had restrictive covenants that were fairly routine parts of new housing developments. To give an example, Levittown, New York is something of the icon for the new suburb, giving new opportunity to working class Americans. But in fact, that was mostly working class non-Black Americans, because the very first residents had to sign racially restrictive covenants, but that was fairly typical. And in the 20th century, this was something that was a regular part of the culture, that where you could live, what you could buy, where you were expected to live, was governed heavily by race. And that was part of it. And then part of it was who could own, because we had all this promotion of home ownership in the 20th century. And that, helped a whole generation basically build wealth. But for the most part, Black people are excluded from that. In various laws, the essentially racist premises of the the society at the time were built into some of the key federal laws. So that made it hard, whether we were talking about housing, federal housing laws, the GI Bill, and so on. Now, I mentioned zoning, and zoning's significant in a lot of ways, but it clearly has a big issue, a big impact in terms of equity. First off, the separation in the markets meant we had very highly segregated communities by income emerge. So even leaving race aside, marketing went to have every place that you develop ensure you that your neighbors would be what one of my friends calls JLUs, people just like us. And so, they were segmented by income down to the, $5,000 level. So you're already going to separate people a lot when you do that, because this community is for people that make six figures, and this people is making, less than 60,000, and so on. Even if you didn't have an explicitly racial component. But of course, the other impacts are that they restrict the development of various kinds of housing, because they make things really homogeneous, which means that in the advantageous places that are zoned in ways that are favorable to people of high income, they don't have to have anything that is more dense housing that would be more affordable. And so, we have, again, this extreme separation. And then when you add in things like school districts and all that, it's a system that is going to isolate the people who are the least well off. And over time, that compounds as they don't get to build the same kind of family wealth. And I think this is one particular headline happened to be in Fortune a few weeks ago. But there's a growing recognition that this is a major issue for our country that persists. and to, again, review a little bit on the housing policy, redlining came in with federal bills that mostly were aimed at making it possible for people to have housing. When the federal housing was created in the New Deal. But frankly, the people who controlled the legislation, especially the money legislation in the Congress, represented southern states that had formal segregation policies, and they insisted on those provisions being included in the legislation. So, as a result, when Fannie Mae starts handing out lots of money, it's great for a generation of Americans, but basically white Americans, with only 2% of non-whites benefiting in that big period between the late 30s and the early 60s. Again, I mentioned the GI Bill included a lot of the same provisions that were in the FHA legislation. And then we got urban renewal, or urban removal, as some people call it, which directly displaced lots of communities, which turned out to be mostly Black communities. So, it's typical that we have segregation in most of our cities, even if we don't have it legally. Again, just did some work in Grand Rapids, but, not to pick on them, but it's, an example. If you look at income distribution, you see what happened here in the typical American city, with the higher income areas being at the peripheries, and, the downtown, having kind of let out. And there's a, there's a, call a favored quarter here, which does really well. And then in this area down here, you see a concentration of this. These are areas that are majority Black or Latino in the city. Again, you find that pattern all over the place. The point is, it's not unrelated to all these policies that we had. And the other thing to note is that you're starting to get high income in the middle here in downtown, reflecting the changes that I was talking about. It hasn't progressed as far as in Grand Rapids as some other places, but it's clearly happening. And so, what's threatened there? And this is where, people become legitimately concerned, because as this begins to grow, that means these areas here, the land becomes more valuable, and people who live there who mostly rent, because again, they didn't get on the train to have home ownership because of previous restrictions, and that means they're vulnerable to displacement. And obviously that's a real concern we all have to think about. Again, transportation had a lot to do with this. Highway building ripped through cities, and divided places and displaced mostly poorer communities. And that's, again, showing up as people are beginning to recognize that a lot of the highways that went through bulldozed those neighborhoods, cut them off, and so on. There's also, some interesting things. I mean, there's different preconceptions, but I thought this was interesting. This guy, Freemark, runs a very interesting site on transportation, but he posted this a while back, where he noted that people of color are 35 to 65% more likely to take transit, bike, walk, or carpool to work than their white counterparts. Again, this is highly correlated with income, because it's expensive to maintain a car. So let me talk a little bit about just what some of this means. What we need in terms of land use policies, we need more compact, walkable development. The market wants it. That's why it's driving up the prices all over the place, and in many cases threatening lower income communities and communities of color. And that is a problem when we're trying to fix things and make things better in places, because whatever you make it better, it becomes more valuable, mostly because it's undersupplied. And that's, again, something that often isn't understood, and people who, I think would benefit from some of the changes we're talking about may become, suspicious, hostile, or outright opposed, because they think it's simply going to, take their communities and ship them out. So we need a higher supply so that it isn't disproportionately expensive. We need more housing generally, and more specifically, we need housing of different types to suit the different kinds of families that we have. That means more compact housing. It means different forms, whether it's apartments or townhouses or duplexes. We've lost the variety, and particularly in what people call missing middle housing, because we sort of regulated and subsidized just a few types of housing. We need more infill, because we have lots of places in this country and cities where there used to be buildings, there aren't anymore, where you could put more things in a place and accommodate them and help to deal with that supply issue while creating things that use existing infrastructure and are less expensive, um, and providing people homes near where they can work and shop and go to school and so on. And we need more investment in active transportation. We've poured money into highways, and as we've added them and added and added them, there's been a decreasing return. We have many cities in this country where if you look at the population in 1950, say, and then look at the population in 2000, you see that it's actually the population didn't change. It just spread out all over the place. And so we multiplied the road network at great cost, and we find out that people are sitting in traffic for longer than they ever did before. So what we need is more investment in other forms of transportation, maintain what we've got, but put more into walkability. In order to do this, there are a number of different things that are necessary, but changing the way we regulate at the local level is a big part of it. More flexible zoning, more streamlined administrative procedures can, as this Brookings paper said, make housing more affordable. I don't necessarily agree with those who think that would solve the whole problem. There's also issues on the income side, and when you have a very skewed income distribution, I think you're going to have a housing affordability problem no matter what. But at the local level, we can do things and we can make things better. There's an interesting debate going on, of course, about single-family zoning. It's interesting in many ways because of where it's coming from, and it seems to be coming from both left and right. So, on the one hand, we have people who want to stop the exclusive communities that only allow, people who can buy McMansions to live in them and have all the best access to all the best services and so on. But we're also seeing people on the kind of free market right saying, that the zoning is a problem because it's a market restriction. And, whether that turns out into be a real policy change over the next couple of years remains to be seen, but it's certainly interesting, and it's at least got people focused on the question of how did we get ourselves into this, and looking at the regulatory issues, at the very local level that are part of it. So to say a little bit more on housing, there's a number of different things you can look at. This is some data that comes out of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and one of the things that they noticed in recent years is that the number of cost, and by cost burden, I should say, we talk about the standard used is 30% of income. If you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, you're considered cost burdened because there's less to spend on everything else like food, clothing, medicine, entertainment, whatever else you have. And it's a somewhat arbitrary standard, but it's a way of measuring. And that has been rising for a long time. But for homeowners, it started going down in recent years, post-recession. But on the other hand, for renters, it kept going up basically. And this is, another indication of the division in our society between haves and have-nots. Not every homeowner is wealthy, but if you own your home, you have a pretty significant asset. If you're not able to, you're more vulnerable. So again, we need to increase the supply, and there are lots of ways to do it. It doesn't have to mean, skyscrapers. We're talking about, modest increases in density to the way we built communities even in small towns 100 years ago or 70 years ago even. There are little policy changes, for instance, the notion of accessory dwelling units, some people call them granny flats or mother-in-law units. This is something published just recently in Mortgage News Daily showing that it's been on the rise in this country, again, reflecting that tremendous demand. I would say that this also points out that it's about 5 states that account for most of that growth. But this is an example of kind of a small policy change that can make a difference. On the transportation side, as I said, we've got to invest in different ways. It's not practical for people to walk in many places where we've designed them for cars, and the blocks are too long. Even if there is a sidewalk, the roads are too wide. We have curb cuts all over the place, bringing conflicts of pedestrians, and we kill a lot of people on our streets. And then there are things that are just silly. Walkability, if you look at the United States, and I imagine, let's see a show of hands. How many of you know Walk Score? Heard of Walk Score? Okay, so if you don't know Walk Score, go to walkscore.com and plug in any place like your address or any other address, and you get a number from 0 to 100. And it's a measure of walkability and basically how much you can get to without a car. And if you look at the typical community in America, you get results like this, which say that, walk toward 34 means you pretty much have to use a car to get everywhere, to get to most of your things. Lexington, Fayette's not different than most of America when you look at it this way. On the other hand, if you look in more closely and you go to parts of the town, so like, let's say downtown Lexington, you see a very different picture. This gets a 90, which they call Walker's Paradise. It's also very bikeable. And my point is that we actually have the models, we have the places, and this is the land that is actually becoming more valuable. So people want to build there, but often our regulations don't make it possible. So, well, just to sum up, in the 20th century, we really changed the rules. We came up with new ways to plan and build communities, and we, in the process, swept away the practice of centuries and millennia. And the main points of them were that those prescribed a strict separation of land uses and oriented things to the automobile. We then handed the first category to a new set of practitioners, the planners, the new planning profession, and the second to traffic engineers, essentially. And they were really separate. They're separate in different departments in our governments and mostly at different levels, because mostly we do the land use planning at the local level and the transportation planning at the state level, transportation funding at the state level, obviously. And that has consequences because the two don't often talk to one another. And the other thing we did was to essentially incorporate or ratify the racist policies of post-Civil War America in a lot of these new practices. The reasons we were trying to do this was to deal with some problems of health and safety and to facilitate the car. And the third one was less explicit, but definitely there. So the consequences of this were we segregated our communities both by income and race. We made everybody dependent on the automobile for almost everything they had to do. We kill lots of people on the roads. We have a health impact in terms of obesity, diabetes, and so on from a more sedentary lifestyle. And everybody who can't drive is dependent on all those who can. And that turns out to be something, around 30% or more of the population. People who are too young, people who are old, people who have one kind of, physical impairment or another, or just can't afford a car, are now significantly less free in our society because, they don't have the freedom the car gives you in a society that says you need a car to get everywhere. And then, of course, we have the lingering consequences of all the places we destroyed in urban renewal and highway building and so on. As a result, we lost a lot in the basic fundamental economies of aggregation, the reason why cities work. We left behind aging infrastructure there, and in the new places, we got expensive new infrastructure, and that we're now finding it harder to maintain and replace as they get older. And we built all this highway and more highway, hoping that would end congestion, which it turned out it didn't really do. But we, in the process, created new barriers between communities. And now we have the ever-growing cost of maintaining that stuff. So the bottom line is that in the 21st century, everything from environmental demands to public health demands to economic demands support significantly changing things. And the market has, and I would argue will continue throughout this century to support doing things very differently. I think we simply can't afford to continue with what we had been doing. And with that, that's probably enough for me to talk, and I should stop and see what you want to talk about. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate it. It was really interesting. And I think, as we were talking, it was so important, I think, for us and our work, obviously, towards smart growth, to hear about these perspectives and this history from a national perspective as well. And for us to remember that, we're this incredibly unique community in the way that we do things, but at the same time, the problems that you talked about and the problems that we face here are very similar to cities across the country. And so, I've got a few questions for you. I've got a few questions in the chat as well. And so, as you talked about the historical injustices as it relates to segregation and discrimination and racial injustices, what policies have you seen And I wonder too about some of the most very basic policies that cities across the country are beginning to consider as they change their policy, their land use and zoning policy, excuse me, that can prevent displacement as we continue to encourage infill and redevelopment, as we continue to encourage investments in downtowns and making walkable communities. What policies have you seen people putting in place in cities that are facing these issues to prevent displacement?
So I'd say first off that you have to be intentional as you're beginning whatever your plans are. It's first of all, it needs to be not just project based, but guided by a larger vision. And that vision has to incorporate what your goals are for your community in terms of who's going to live there. That's preserving existing communities. It's making possible for more people of different income levels to live there. Then you have to build that in from the beginning, and that's the kind of thing we didn't used to do. And still, a lot of places, some of the places that are making improvements, will look at their community and say, well, we don't have a housing affordability problem, so why would we need to do that? And don't anticipate that you're going to have one when you're successful. Other places it's really obvious and it's difficult to do in part because it's expensive. And so it takes a certain amount of commitment. So I'll give you some specific examples. I'll start with one that in my community here where I live in Arlington, Virginia, where I served in government for about 18 years. We had a lot of the benefits of the change. I mean, for a variety of reasons. When the sort of renaissance of walkable real estate of urban places was happening, we were a transforming suburb that took advantage of it real early. I think more than we knew we didn't necessarily see what was going to happen, that it was going to be so good, but it did result in tremendous growth for us, growing tax base, all that stuff. We got written up and we got awards and that kind of thing. But we also had the problems sooner than other places. So what a lot of people are experiencing in the last 10 years, we were experiencing before that. And part of that was the issue of, so what happens to these communities we have where people have been able to afford to live here, and the rent is, the real estate values are rising, and so they are at risk of displacement. And we didn't get it all right at first, but basically we had to put in place from early on new approaches to affordable housing, and to start working them into new developments in the places that were becoming valuable. And so, we had particular things like a revolving loan fund to support mostly nonprofits in creating committed affordable housing, and requiring contributions in the developments that, were doing really well, making, doing quite well off the increased density that we were enabling, and making them contribute to affordable housing, either by providing it on-site or offsite or paying for it. And then as we kind of got better about this and we started planning a new corridor where we had, there weren't a lot of benefits in one of our corridors that had most of the lower income minority communities, immigrant communities. And the question was, well, what happens, to all these folks? And so when we got around to that, we said, before we put policies in place that will allow people to redevelop or encourage them to redevelop, we need to figure out how we ensure that everybody who lives there now basically could continue to live there. And so that involved pretty extensive effort of inventorying what was out there. I'm not just talking about, like we didn't have public housing, but, committed affordable housing of various kinds. I'm talking about market rate housing, because that's basically what happens. It's market rate housing you lose for people at low and moderate income. So we had to know what that was, and then we had to figure out how much we would need to replace all of it if things started going up, and to build into our plan a set of tools that were calibrated to essentially create an adequate number of new units or preserve old units. And we put that in place so that we would have housing affordability and affordable housing rising along with higher income housing and that kind of thing. And that so far is working fairly well. We have a large portion of the development here in this corridor, which happens to be near where I live, that is committed affordable housing right alongside much higher value development. And I think that's the main lesson for communities all around, that if you want to do something about this, you got to commit to it early, you got to build it into your plans, and you have to invest some money in it. And that means things like, as I said, we use a revolving loan fund and a number of other kinds of policies that, use mechanisms, in some cases, some communities use mechanisms like TIFs to support affordable housing. But it's integrating these policies, the financial policy that deals with housing with the planning policy that approves development and so on.
Great, and just a little bit more on that. Can you talk about what you see as the relationship between the lack of supply of new walkable mixed-use neighborhoods and the issues like gentrification and displacement that you were just talking about in our urban core, which was originally designed, to be compact and walkable?
Right. So now that, people have sort of rediscovered those places, and places that, 2 generations ago were abandoned, those in a free market, or more or less free market, people with money are going to go, invest in them, and they move in. They're looking for a nice place to live too, and they find a place they can afford. But when that's happening on a large scale market, that means that the value of those things are going to rise, and people who live there already, if they don't own, will find their rents going up. So, the real problem is that the supply has been so restricted because we haven't been building it. And, we continue to overbuild one type of development for so many years and decades that we've got this big oversupply on the one hand and undersupply on the other. And in any given year, it's not like the market for bread. If you had a shortage at one time, within a year, you'd have lots of bread, and lots of other things you can think about. But the built environment, we only change 1% or 2% a year, even in big boom years. It's a stock. So it takes a long time to catch up. So what we have is an imbalance that's going to take a long time to adjust. And meanwhile, most of the policies in place, still reflect that old system. So where, not only is it the market will take a while to catch up, but we make it hard. We make it easy to build stuff. And, single family home, you can build all over the place. The zoning's in place. It's by right. It's easy to do. Try to build in, in a downtown area or old neighborhoods, not just downtown, but old compact neighborhoods. It's a lot harder. We don't encourage it. We don't fund it as much. So that keeps the supply low, which means, again, if you live in one of these communities and you see people with income coming, the first, coffee shop that shows up can be a threat to you. And, you can see that as, I don't want to lose my neighborhood, I don't want my home. And I understand, why people would feel that way. But ultimately, what we need is more supply of that stuff. Otherwise, there's no way. The price, as long as it's constrained, the price will continue to rise with growing incomes and growing population. And so we need to unleash the supply and make it more possible for people of every income to live in these places.
So going on that too, I mean, in addition to the policy barriers, and I think we were speaking to with as it relates to the incentive barriers, as well for developers contributing to affordable housing funds or providing affordable housing and things like that, policies that encourage those types of incentives. What are the other biggest barriers that you've seen as you've worked with cities as they try to encourage housing diversity in neighborhoods?
Well, I mean, it's hard to, ignore zoning. But there are other kinds of regulations also that impact it. In many places, if you take away the zoning, if you loosen up the zoning, and many places are looking to form-based codes and that kind of thing, which can be very helpful. But sometimes it's not even, that's not the binding constraint. Sometimes the places have found that they liberalize those regulations, but they still don't get the development that they might like to have, because in any particular market, you have other issues. For instance, will the people who finance development, the banks and so on, will they support it? They may, even if you don't have the high parking requirements that we imposed with zoning. We basically made every single piece of property support its own development with its own parking, which meant you couldn't have stores right next to each other because you had to surround them all with parking lots. And the zoning implicitly does that, even if that's not what people intentionally, initially intended. So, you take those things away, but now somebody who's going to invest says, well, the manual says that you're supposed to have this much parking, because a manual, maintained by people like the Institute for Transportation Engineers, thrown together in 1950s on the basis of something or other, says this is what you have and, what you have to have. So, you can wind up with a financing problem. You can wind up with a tenant who's going to go into a building And to build to build a building, I might need to have a lease with a credit-worthy tenant to start with, so I can get my bank loan. And that credit-worthy tenant, the national store or whatever it is, may say, our manual says we have to have this many parking spaces. So, you wind up with those kind of things. You have other kinds of barriers. If you're doing committed affordable housing, you're trying to get a mixed use project, and you have to, take advantage in particular of the low income tax credit, the federal means by which we support most committed affordable housing in the country. There are a lot of restrictions. It's hard to do mixed income because the way they award points for it, you're better off doing it all, basically all low income, even though everybody wants really a mixed income property. And it's hard to do mixed use because of restrictions that are on, how much of it can be non-housing. So, you have these various restrictions from the federal level, the state level, and the housing agencies, the private financing. A lot of these things are significant barriers. And then, of course, there's all the transportation related issues because you have standards promulgated by state transportation departments and often local public works or transportation departments that make it very hard to create a walkable environment, that promote having lots of curb cuts rather than consolidating them, excessive parking requirements as mentioned, street widths, lane widths that are excessive, and everything oriented toward moving vehicular traffic, particularly the standards for what's called level of service, which again, it's old standards, doesn't really reflect mobility needs, but can have a big impact on what you're allowed to do with your street system.
Can you speak a little bit to, Lexington is a university city. We've got, the University of Kentucky, Transylvania University. We're surrounded by many universities. So, in a university city, how does student housing impact the desired housing mix, as well as integrated communities? How does that interplay with displacement, as well as affordability in your experience?
Well, so to start with, a university is a great asset.
Right.
The places that don't have universities, that's, it's an issue for them. It's wonderful both as a place of employment itself and the fact that it's generating the kind of people that employers want. And if you can capture some of them who are leaving, they don't all have to stay in your town, but, you capture some, that's really an asset. So it's mostly a very positive thing. Clearly, there are tensions, and particularly with housing, many different reasons, partly because many people, have negative associations with student housing or with basically neighborhoods that are dominated by people who are 18 to 22-year-olds and, living the way 18 to 22-year-olds live. And then there are also conflicts when a university is growing and it tends to, dominate an area and create more housing for its growing student population. That also can impact communities, often low-income communities, communities of color. So, a lot of those tensions are definitely there and real in most places that have a big university presence. I think the question is, can you tap into the tremendous value there is? And I've generally found that universities have been pretty positive in recent decades in recognizing the impact they have on their surrounding environment and realizing that their future is tied up with there being, a good environment around them, and maybe a little more open to their responsibilities with regard to the communities and the past than some other institutions. I think the other big institution is medicine, and hospitals are a lot harder to deal with, I'd say, because they do tend to wall off communities and focus entirely inside. But yeah, there are definitely challenges, but it's also exacerbated by the fact that we've had this sort of almost bifurcated or pigeonholed, housing production. And so instead of having a spectrum of different types of houses, from single family on large lot to single family on small lot to duplex and triplex and all that kind of thing, we've basically had, the part of town that has all the older stuff you used to have, and that's now occupied by students, and other people now want it too, so that's driving up the value. And then we have the place with all the stuff we made endlessly and endlessly decade after decade. If we open up our regulation and our markets to produce a wider variety of housing, then I think we'll also have more of a mix. And we don't, I don't think it's necessarily the best thing to have one place where all the students live and nobody else lives. And, if you have more choice and more options, you'd find people, living, there'd be more opportunity for everybody, basically.
Absolutely. Can you speak a little bit on microclimate? That's a question that's come up in a few different of our Citizen Planning Academy sessions as well. So, as we work to do infill and redevelopment, which is our adopted growth strategy here in Lexington as well, and you spoke to how that is fiscally responsible and sustainable as well for cities. Can you talk about how infill and redevelopment can affect microclimate, where you have more dense development and paving, and how that affects any environmental effects that could have on a community?
Well, mostly you have less paving. I mean, that's one of the big impacts. The suburbanization and again, the specific type of suburbanization, which was so heavily car dependent, has basically caused us to pave over vast areas of all the areas we populate. And so you have lots and lots of impervious surface, which causes water runoff problems and creates heat islands all over the place. So there are a lot of different environmental impacts from all of that. More compact development basically means less of that. You may be more conscious that an urban area is more hardscaped, but the fact is you'd be then freeing up all kinds of other land that can be other things like parks, like farming. We have an interest now in locally sourcing foods in many places, but partly that became a novelty because we moved all the agriculture so far away from where we live, and we ship things from long distances to a greater degree than really is necessary. But that's partly because we ate up all the land with so much pavement between roads and parking, vast parking lots. So reducing that means having less of an impact, whether we're talking about runoff, heat island, and just the resource that is land. We essentially have undervalued land in all its uses, and we could have much more in the way of, parks and local produce and, places for water to, stormwater to more naturally be filtered and all that if we developed more compactly than we have.
And this is a big question, I imagine, and I know that cities around the country are facing this as well. How do we change citizen mindset? So how do you balance between the concerns that citizens in neighborhoods and desirable neighborhoods feel about infill and redevelopment, while also trying to do what's best for our community as a whole as we work on intentionally growing it?
Well, that's a really big area. I'll try to give a relatively brief answer to that. I'm not good at brief answers, as you may have noticed, but so one is that you have to engage people, and we very strongly believe that the way you make change is at the it's really at the grassroots level, and you've got to meet people where they are and understand their values and their concerns, and show them how to best attain their goals. Because we find that you go to communities almost anywhere, when you start talking to people, no matter how far apart they sound, there's a whole lot of stuff people actually will come to the same conclusion on. They'll come to the same solutions on. You've done a lot of charrettes and situations where people start way apart, where there's always somebody comes to that table who's just, he's there because they said he had to be there, but he doesn't believe in this thing. And by the end, that person also has a marker in his hand and is coming up with solutions. And when people start doing that, they will come to a lot of common ground. And I really believe that's very powerful. It does mean understanding that the people who you're dealing with have genuine concerns. You have to give them the benefit of the doubt. You have to try to empathize with kind of everybody on all sides of these issues. I've never liked the term NIMBY, because to me that's just calling people names, and that's not getting to a solution. I found that if you deal with homeowners who are concerned about what happens in their backyard, you can often find out the reasons why they're concerned about that, and you can address it, and you can show them that solutions that you propose could be good for them. And I think ultimately that's a large part of it. We need to change hearts and minds, so we need to show people how this is beneficial to them. It turns out most people actually like living in a community where their kids can afford to live, where they can walk to things like kids can walk to school, where where they can get groceries easily, where not everybody in the family has to get in the car every time. Most people actually like that, even if they like to have a car. It turns out that people will support a lot of things if they understand what it gets them. And on the larger level, I think part of the reason we've made the economic argument is we need people to understand taxes in a lot of these communities are going up because you're developed inefficiently. And you'd have, instead of having to figure out what services you're cutting, what taxes you're raising, you could be doing the opposite. if you develop more efficiently over time. And we need more people to understand that.
Well, I know we've gone over a little bit, so I appreciate everyone that's hung on here. And Chris, thank you so much for your time. We do have a couple of other questions that we weren't able to get answered today. And for those, I just want to let you all know, if you did submit a question that wasn't answered, we will try our best to get those answered. So we'll follow up with Chris and see if he can provide some answers. And then we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a recording of this session, as well as answers to some questions. And in addition to that, some resources. I think some resources that Chris mentioned we would love to link and send out in the email to you all. So be on the lookout for that email tomorrow. But Chris, thank you so much for your insight and your expertise and sharing your knowledge with us. Like I said before, I think that as unique of a community as we are, it's so important for us also to remember that these issues that we face here in Lexington, like housing affordability and diversity, gentrification, displacement, these questions are being faced all over the country, and there's certainly common ground where we hope to learn how other people in other cities are dealing with these issues as we work on our own. And I think we know also, from your presentation and the work that we do, that policy, grassroots policy at the local level is the key place to begin those conversations, which is what we're trying to do today, to have these community conversations about how we begin to change these policies. So, we really want to encourage at Fate Alliance all Lexingtonians to advocate for smart growth and the sustainability of their communities, whether that's addressing transportation needs, displacement, housing access, or access to fresh food. So we hope that this conversation provided some information and a framework in which we can all work towards smart, equitable growth here in Lexington. So thanks again, Chris, and thanks to all of you who stayed with us, even though we went a little bit over time. Be on the lookout for the email that will go out tomorrow as a follow-up to this conversation. And Chris, we'll look forward to seeing you this evening at Citizens Planning Academy, and we hope to get you in person in Lexington sometime soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.